Okay, folks. So again, Russ Froio here, Philadelphia chapter, where Mike is now presenting. I'm going to turn the microphone over to him. If anybody has any problems, just put something in the chat and we'll rectify it. Thank you, Mike.
You'll keep it in the chat. Okay.
Hi. Thank you, Russ, for having me. I've lost count how many times I've given talks here, but it's always a treat to be here. You guys have always been really kind to me. So thank you for having me back. As many of you know, I've been working on a study of the former Pennsylvania Railroad. It's a project called From the Main Line. And I always start this out, certainly all of us here are not the uninitiated, but I always like to open my lectures with one of the greatest articles that were written about the Pennsy at its prime. There we go. In 1936, Fortune magazine ran a feature article on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I always feel like it's the best way to preface the question, why did I decide to study the Pennsylvania Railroad? The article opens, do not think of the Pennsylvania Railroad as a business enterprise. Think of it as a nation. It's a nation bigger than Turkey or Uruguay. The Pennsylvania is the most powerful railroad of all nations in the Northern Hemisphere. Its revenues are 11% of all railroad revenues. Its employees are 12% of all railroad employees, who receive 11% of all railroad wages. 1 of every 10 locomotives in the United States are owned by the Pennsylvania, as is 13.7% of all freight cars and 15% of all passenger cars. A dime of every dollar invested on the railroad has been spent to build the Pennsylvania Railroad. For every 100 tons of freight that moved a mile by rail in 1933, the Pennsylvania Railroad carried 10. It also carried 1 in every 5 passengers. Half of the people of the United States live in the territory that the Pennsylvania Railroad drains, from St. Louis and Chicago to Long Island and the Chesapeake Bay. So it seems fairly obvious why one would choose to document the Pennsylvania Railroad, but for me, the reality was the Pennsylvania Railroad had been gone for some 55 years, presenting the question, how does one document what's gone? When I began this project in 2007, I really had no idea what this work should look like, but I began drawing from previous projects as a starting point. I think what differed for this project than previous projects in my work is that this project required a lot of context. For me, that was a visual reference, historically speaking, that would help sort of charge and inform contemporary imagery. That reference would come from the imagery of William H. Rowell. With a long and successful career, Rowell was commissioned by the Pennsylvania Railroad on several occasions. One of the most notable was conducted in the early 1890s to illustrate the road for display at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. What I found really striking about Rowell's work was, for the most part, it didn't focus on the trains themselves per se, but more so the railroad in situ. Formally, his photographs were beautifully composed. They smartly juxtaposed historical narratives alongside the modern railroad. On a technical level, I also connected with Rowell's use of a large format view camera. Working in both 18 by 22 inch and 18 by 44 inch formats, Rowell made these mammoth plate prints, often in albumin or platinum palladium. Unfortunately, I didn't have the money or the ability to work in that sort of scale, but I often employed a 4x5, 5x7, and 8x10 view camera to make this work. So the dialogue between my own work and Rowell, it functions on different levels. Historically speaking, the imagery offers a perspective of past events. It speaks of a railroad that's about to hit its full potential, which helps to complete the story leading up to and after the era when the Pennsylvania Railroad was truly the standard railroad of the world. Additionally, the writing of Harvard landscape studies professor John Stilgoe helped define various themes and approaches I had instinctively been employing. Drawing from these dialogues fosters an ability to disseminate the layers of history while doing contemporary work within the landscape. While this opportunity sometimes presents itself, this work was never meant to be a rephotographic survey, but rather an evolving dialogue with the formal, informational, and contextual characteristics of historic works. With Rao's imagery and Stilgo's writing as a foundation, the project moved in a direction that would consider all parts of the sum to illustrate the scale of the system, its feats of engineering, its imprint on the American landscape, and the remains that speak of its past. These thematic approaches help convey the railroad corridor and its relationship to the American landscape. Visually, they can function on their own. Some approaches tend to be more documentational or informational than others, but combined, they provide viewers with a palpable sense of the might and imprint the railroad made on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Considering the scale of the man-made corridor cutting across the landscape's topography and its monumental infrastructure, including its terminals and piers and rail yards that are often not seen by the public, and the efforts of the improvement era, where dedicated lines for moving tonnage cut new uninterrupted paths across the Northeast. To the electrification of the congested eastern region between 1918 and 1938 in the industrial Northeast. And in the wider context of the landscape, we consider the literal and the figurative stations that connected people and places with their network and the nation. And also the rivers that often so provided the suitable path for canals and railroads alike. And within these landscapes, the stories like the Conemaugh Valley at Southport in relation to the catastrophic flood of 1889. To consider its remains, we must include its predecessors, such as the Commonwealth-owned Main Line of Public Works, the canal and rail system, a precursor to the Pennsylvania Railroad. I always appreciate looking at the evidence of previous alignments and relics from the improvement era from 1889 to 1906. And finally, the loss and changes of a network reflected by the division of property since Penn Central, the creation of Amtrak and Conrail, and its now successors, CSX and Norfolk Southern. The best way to see these themes and their interaction is really through sequencing. Naturally, as a linear network, the progression of the railroad and the landscape by default can be placed in geographic order. In a nod to how Rao and others photographs would work to disseminate to the public what they accomplished, this lecture includes a curated sort of experiential route guide to share with you, reminiscent of the ones produced by the railroad in the 19th century. With that in mind, we're going to take a trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh on the Pennsylvania Railroad main line. From Philadelphia's 30th Street Station, we depart from the centerpiece of one of the biggest public-private urban renewal projects, which took place in Philadelphia for over 20 years. And we weave our way through Penn coach yards. The westward passenger main snakes its way through the 36th Street connection towards the Vanishwest section of the city. Soaring over the line is the West Philadelphia Elevated Branch, often referred to as the High Line. The elevated branch was completed in 1903 and continues to serve as a bypass for freight traffic around the busy passenger terminal. At the epicenter of one of the most complex junctions in the world stands the interlocking tower at Zoo, named for its proximity to the Philadelphia Zoological Gardens. Zoo is the apex of the Pennsylvania Railroad in the east, with all routes to the north, south, east, and west. And yes, I understand Pennsylvania Railroad only considered east and west a direction. Framed by City Line Avenue, the dividing point between Philadelphia and Montgomery counties, Overbrook offers a juxtaposition of eras, with a station house dating from 1860 and the interlocking tower dating from the 1930s. Heading west was the combined passenger and freight main lines, the famous 4-track Broadway. Between Overbrook and Paoli was the fabled main line, named both for the Pennsylvania Railroad and its predecessor, the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which was part of the main line of public works. Along this stretch, the railroad planned and developed country-like communities to encourage the wealthy to live and commute to Philadelphia, and of course, commute by rail. Paoli marks the western end of the commuter district and the end of the first phase of electrification completed in 1918. The phrase, "nothing is more holy than the local to Paoli," stood true because so many Pennsylvania Railroad executives rode these trains, you didn't damn dare to delay them. At Whitford, we encounter one of our first relics, the crossing of the Philadelphia and Thorndale branch by a massive pin-connected Pennsylvania truss bridge, part of a network collectively known as the Low Grade. At Coatesville, the railroad soars across the stone viaduct, crossing the Brandywine River Valley. In the distance stands the many buildings of the sprawling steel complex that started as Lugan's Iron in 1818. Crossing from Chester to Lancaster County, the main line swings through a series of reverse curves to climb the grade over Mine Ridge. Diverging from the main line to the east was the Eklund and Susquehanna, part of that low grade that went across southern Lancaster County to the Susquehanna River. From Philadelphia to Lancaster, the main line was largely part of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad built in 1834. By 1854, the Pennsylvania Railroad assumed ownership of the failed network, revising and improving the alignment for years to come. In Christiana, there's a beautiful culvert over Noble Run that survives on the original right-of-way some 20 yards from the extant railroad. Arriving in Lancaster, the elevated passenger waiting room over the tracks rings familiar, sharing designs similar to Trenton, Harrisburg, and Baltimore. The head house is a beautiful brick and limestone space and supported several amenities for travelers to and from the Red Rose City. The route from Lancaster to Harrisburg was chartered in 1834 as the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mountjoy, and Lancaster, becoming a critical link to bypass the inclined plane of Columbia and provide all rail service from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. Middletown, located at the mouth of Swatara Creek and the Susquehanna, dates back to the early years of canal transportation and rafting well before the railroads. In Harrisburg, trains still arrive under the Fink trusses of the train shed dating from the late 1800s. To the west marks the original line under the 1846 charter of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was charged with building a privately owned railroad from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh in an effort to protect trade and commerce between Philadelphia and points west when the state's own main line of public works proved impractical and unprofitable. The first challenge the Pennsylvania Railroad faced when building westward was the mile-wide Susquehanna River. The extant bridge is the final of 3 such attempts, completed in 1902, and Rockville remains as the largest stone masonry arch bridge in the world, measuring 3,820 feet long. The main line navigates the western bank of the Susquehanna River to the confluence of the Juniata. From here, the main line diverges west along the Juniata, following the same route as the State Canal. Crossing Big Buffalo Creek, 2 generations of stone bridges provide a juxtaposition of the era of capacity improvements. Here in the distance, the new bridge carried a 4-track right-of-way built along the former canal alignment. The photograph being made standing on the original bridge, a smaller brick-lined arch bridge, also along the Buffalo Creek. At Mifflin, the beautiful station with leanings of Spanish architectural elements stands sentinel. Mifflin is a town typical of many, an offshoot of the original town, Mifflin Town, on the opposite side of the Juniata River. Mifflin was developed to connect the town with the railroad once it came to town. Deep in the Lewistown Narrows, the railroad and the canal threaded their way through a narrow gap in the Blue Mountains. Early stonework along the distant banks dates to the original construction of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And opposite the railroad, the remains of the Juniata Division survive, this being lift block number 13 at Macedonia Run. Lewistown Junction marks the site of the oldest extant passenger station on the railroad and the connection with the Sunbury and Lewistown branches. Rail yards here once served the local industrial economy, including American Viscose and Standard Steel in nearby Burnham. In Matawana, this structure stands along the railroad at East John Street. If you look carefully at the date mark on the bottom left corner of the building, you'll note it's dated 1850, which was the same year that the railroad came to town. Bridge 147 is one of the later stone bridges crossing the Juniata. It was built on the alignment of the former canal aqueduct at the east end of the industrial town of Mount Union. What's interesting about Bridge 147, while most of the stone bridges were known for William H. Brown's work, this one actually carries the name of his successor, Alexander C. Shand, who later on would abandon stone for the use of reinforced concrete. Company houses of one of the several brick manufacturers line Pennsylvania Avenue along the old main line, and of course the interchange with the East Broadtop Railroad. When the railroad often used the canal property to relocate the railroad, these old alignments were retained to serve local customers and connections with other railroads. High above Jack's Narrows, you can see the village of Mapleton. Mapleton in this region is rich with Ganister rock quarries, which is used for making high quality refractory brick, hence the brickworks in Mount Union. This particular quarry employed a trail of over 1,000 steps that quarrymen climbed every day to get to work, known as the 1,000 Steps Trail. I can speak from experience. There's way more than 1,000 steps on this trail. It's more like 1,200. With the same mountains visible in the distance, a small frame house stands along the right-of-way in the quiet village of Mapleton itself. And in a nod to William Rao, we can see the face of Sidling Hill and Terrace Mountain to the left and Stone Ridge on the right, signifying the approach to Huntington on the Juniata River. Here, the original passenger station from 1872 stands at a distance from the extant main line, reflecting the location of the original right-of-way through town. In Huntington, the county seat, several relics stand along Penn and Allegheny Street. On Standing Stone Creek, the juxtaposition of an early stone bridge in the foreground and its successor are visible from Penn Street. Near the Barry Straight Line, the railroad enjoys some of the last tangent track before entering the major obstacle ahead, the Little Juniata Valley and the mountain, Tussey Mountain. With the sharp oxbow and the Little Juniata nowhere to go, the railroad was faced with no choice but to tunnel through the ridge at Spruce Creek. The first bore was completed in 1849 and supplemented with a second bore to the north, completed in 1889. The original bore, viewed here, was ultimately retired due to being prone to cave-ins after expanding the new tunnel during Conrail's improvements era, the stack clearance improvements era. As we leave Spruce Creek behind, we enter a 10-mile stretch of railroad where engineers face the expensive reality they would have to bridge the Little Juniata 12 times between Spruce Creek and Gray, immediately west of Tyrone. This trackside view is at bridge number 1. At Plummer Hollow, the deck truss span here. Oh, sorry, wrong image. At Jensenmore Run, this is, I believe, bridge number 6, crossing the Little Juniata, and it's a succession of 2 bridges in a very small loop, maybe 3/4 of a mile from one another. Looking west toward the connection of the Bald Eagle branch near Gray, the railroad exits the challenging terrain from Spruce Creek to the open valley through Bell's Gap. We arrive in the railroad city of Altoona, once the beating heart of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which no doubt still has a prominent role in railroading today with Norfolk Southern's Pittsburgh line and the Juniata shops. To the west is the eastern escarpment of the Allegheny Grade and the famed Horseshoe Curve. Descending Horseshoe Norfolk Southern continues to the tradition of moving freight over mountains in Blair County on the legacy of J. Edgar Thompson's approach to surmounting the Allegheny Mountains in 1854. The grades of the Pennsylvania Railroad and New Portage Railroad are evident here in the eastward view from Tunnel Hill near the summit of the Allegheny grade. Thompson's vision and ability afforded the Pennsylvania Railroad and its predecessors a 1.8% ruling grade on the relatively short 11-mile ascent up the east slope. At Crescent, a small vacant terminal is all that remains of the helper base that serviced and dispatched countless helper sets up and down the mountain to move trains and coal originating from branches and mines along the main line. On the west slope, the eastward climb through small hamlets and mining areas is a sustained 25-mile climb from Johnstown, more than double the distance of the east slope. The Sonneman Prep Plant is the loadout along the old main line in Portage, Pennsylvania, whose name hails from its locale along the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The tangent from Summer Hill to the west was once a popular location for the signals that stood here east of the Main Street Bridge. And of course, like many other things, the iconic position light signals of the Pennsylvania Railroad are now not part of this corridor as they've been taken down in the last 10 years. Entering the South Fork Valley, the village of Ehrenfeld clings steep to the terrain to the north of the right-of-way, affording these dramatic views of the valley below. Once a single arch viaduct of the Conemaugh, the big viaduct was wiped out during the flood of 1889 and replaced with the current structure, this graceful two-arch bridge located at a sharp oxbow in the river below. This simple signal from the Conrail era marks the location of AO interlocking, once a remote outpost that got its name from the telegraph abbreviation after oxbow, marking the beginning of the Johnstown terminal area. East Conemaugh and Franklin are some of the first communities along one of the most concentrated industrial stretches of the Pennsylvania Railroad main line. The Pennsylvania Railroad had signs along the railroad that touted that more traffic was generated in this section of railroad at its peak than many others along the Pennsylvania Railroad system. The stately brick station head house stands sentinel over the main line with the iconic inclined plane visible in the distance. The station was designed by architect Kenneth Murchison, and the station greeted countless travelers in the storied steel city of Johnstown. Murchison's work can also be found at Baltimore Penn Station, Lackawanna Station in Scranton, as well as Hoboken Terminal from the Lackawanna. The 1889 stone bridge, which played a central role in the Johnstown flood, continues to serve its purpose today. Visible in the distance was the lower works where the original smith and forging shop from the 1860s continues its legacy with the Center for Metal Arts. Leaving Johnstown behind, the railroad enters the Conemaugh Narrows, running along both sides of the river, the far side, the main line, the right side, the Sang Hollow extension. One of the few areas where the Conemaugh River widens out, New Florence marks the point where the main line crosses back towards the Sang Hollow branch at the junction of the Conemaugh line at Conpit Junction. At Grapeville and Jeanette, glass manufacturing was prevalent. Here, the ruins of the Westmoreland Glass Company stand along the right-of-way. In the industrial towns east of Pittsburgh, the Turtle Creek Valley is home to Pitcairn Yard, one of the largest on the railroad. The view here actually shows two lines, the two main tracks to the left and the single Mon line to the right. The Mon was a gateway to operations to the industrial Mon Valley to the south and a bypass around Pittsburgh to the west. At Wilmerding, the line passes the iconic Westinghouse air brake shop, where one of the most important technological developments in the rail industry has been manufactured for over a century. As we wind our way into the Pittsburgh region, Views of the sprawling Edgar Thompson works are available from the elevated hillside. Thompson, the first chief engineer and third president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was named after the works from his friend Andrew Carnegie, who was given his first opportunity as an employee on the Pennsylvania Railroad when he was a young man by Thompson. Reflecting on the ongoing nature of the project, we leave with one last sweeping view of the Mon Valley, one of the largest steel producing regions of the country and a significant part of the Pennsylvania Railroad's traffic base. Finally, in a dark terminal, we arrive under the canopies of Pittsburgh Penn Station, where the Pennsylvania Railroad once dominated passenger service in the Steel City. I feel like this image is a poignant reminder that one of the biggest losses of many historic roads was the loss of its passenger trains. After many years of work, I thought I would run out of things to photograph on this project, and that is certainly not the case. I continue to work photographing structures and spaces and even noting changes in the landscape from when I began this project 17 years ago, proving over and over that nothing along this landscape or in the American landscape or anywhere in general is permanent. The fact is, the Pennsylvania Railroad, like many other roads that have survived, continues to do exactly what it was intended to do because of the visionaries who engineered and refined a system that lived well beyond its corporate identity. The spirit of the Pennsylvania Railroad is alive and well in its bridges, in its right-of-way, in the conduit it provides for a seemingly endless string of intermodal double-stack trains that the likes of J. Edgar Thompson would never have dreamt of. As I continue to create work for the Mainline project, dissemination comes in many forms, from lectures like this to books and essays, to blog writing and exhibitions. The intention has always been to connect the work to a wider reaching audience. It has led to commission work in the form of engineering documentation and air photo photography for the railroads and other industrial and corporate clients. And as the work continues, it still evolves. The dialogue with local, regional, and national history, imagery, and ephemera still informs and inspires my work, now more than ever. And from this work has come opportunities to grow this effort nationally, being tasked with the opportunity to build a collection of this stature of railroads around the United States for the Library of Congress, celebrating the imprint of railroads in the American landscape at large. The library and many of us recognize the need to preserve and interpret the railroad's impact 100 years after its prime and consider how it continues to shape the American landscape. I'd like to thank the chapter for having me once again, and I'd be happy to answer any questions after my talk. Thank you.
Where was that last photo?
This one?
Yes.
That's actually not the Pensy. That is from the Mahanoy Plain in Minersville. So that is Gerardville. I'm sorry, not Gerardville. Mahanoy Plain down in the bottom from Minersville, Schuylkill County. Any other questions? Anything on the chat? Yes.
You said you could go and program your structures. We could probably do quite a bit of stations that are operating now, and ones that are not operating all along the main line, which should fill in your side.
Yes.
Spaces and everything.
Sure.
Because, you know, when I'm dealing with trains that go by, I often see stations that are derelict, and I'm wondering what they are.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to find out about more of these stations that are still not around anymore.
Sure.
The buildings are there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, you know, the tough part of doing a slideshow like this is you can only cram so much into a 30-minute lecture, but you know, this project's been going for 17 years and there's been a lot of documentation of stations, towers, structures. It's all part of part of the thing, but you're right, it's nice to be able to, it's important to include that in the documentation.
I belong to the really historical. society,
Okay.
And they push their emphasis on the station because.
Sure.
They care what is still there and what is not.
Sure.
So, you know, it's, I think if you could allow for another 15 minutes or so, you could put in a lot more about some of the stations.
That's right. All right, anybody else?
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, bro, Justin.
Yeah, I'm interested in those, 12 different bridges between, like Spruce Creek and Tyrone.
Yeah.
that crisscross the, Old Indiana.
Yep.
Are any of those still in existence?
Oh, yeah, they're all still in
Did
existence.
you get to them, the booklet?
You can get to most of them. Yeah, if you go into Spruce Creek, the road pretty much weaves its way through them. The one at Jensenmore Run, you have to climb up an embankment off of, is that 50? No, it's not 53. 453. You have to climb up on the hillside to see that one. That's a good winter shot. But yeah, almost all of them are accessible.
You gotta go underneath to see the beauty of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, the one just west of that Jensenmore Run, which goes under that 453, there's a quarry road that you can hike down, and that's got one of the most impressive skewed arches on that bridge. It's a really beautiful bridge.
No online questions or compliments.
Okay.
I'll share with you.
Okay, good. All right,
Anybody else?
anybody else? Miranda doesn't have anything to say? Yes.
It's going to be published in a book. At some-
Eventually, that's the goal. Yeah, I'm looking at maybe 3 years to get this wrapped up.
But you can show what things in.
Exactly, yeah, because I photographed the eastern end a little bit. I've done like the New York terminal a little bit. My focus over the next 2 years is to get that wrapped up and also cap off the Pittsburgh end too, because I'm a little light on Pittsburgh. Northeast is just tough to get to because it's congested and restricted, and the Pittsburgh for me is tough to get to because it's so far. So yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right.
I got one question.
Yep.
What was the purpose of the mule shoe?
Can you repeat it for some people?
The purpose of Mule Shoe was basically the New Portage Railroad. It was their effort to compete against the Pennsylvania Railroad. And then once that ultimately failed, the Pennsylvania Railroad bought it, banked it, and then bought it back into existence, during World War II, I believe, to handle increased traffic from the war.
So it ran from like they told the wide switch into.
Yes.
Outside Hollows.
Yeah.
Where did they go?
Right up to, excuse my scrolling backwards here. No, well, it did, yeah. It came in right here. So if you look just beyond that, there's a deck girder bridge on this track, the single track. It came in right there. Yeah, just west of Bennington before the tunnels.
So it's actually like it's.
Yes, eventually. Originally, it connected to the New Portage Tunnel on the far end of town. And then when the Pennsy got controlled, they connected it all back in with their system. Any other questions?
Yeah, Michael,
About the pack settle section, like between Johnstown.
Yeah.
Like it's split, the railroad split on both sides of the river.
Yep. Yeah, you had the Conemaugh on the one side, and then you had the main line on the other. The pack saddle. So there's 3 different locations that the Pennsy always photographed in their 19th century campaigns: the Lewistown Narrows, Jack's Narrows, and the Pack Saddle Narrows. And they were some of the most impressive views. And the only thing I can imagine is that the Pack Saddle was probably photographed the most because they truly looked like they were in the wild. And they built these really beautiful log cabin watch boxes. They had gardens out there to sort of celebrate this industrial, accomplishment out in the woods. But the pack saddles, I photographed it. I'm not happy with it. I want to go back there again. But it's quite involved to get back there.
Yeah,
Anything
Michael.
else?
Yeah, Michael online.
Yeah.
So you got the Tunnel Hill view up there. A favorite of mine. We met back in May at the Station Inn.
Yes.
And one of the sad things that I note is the plant growth out there now makes it impossible to see that view. One of the favorite things about that view is in the right conditions, you can see across the valley. So you see the trains going in front of you, down the slide, disappearing off to the left and showing up again, crossing left to right. And sometimes you can see the same train, both here at the slide and crossing left to right.
Yeah.
A great view, I like.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges with this project has been the overgrowth and foliage. It's just encroaching so much. You know, I've considered employing a drone, but honestly, with the way I operate, I just don't want the attention. I don't like putting a drone up in people's backyards or in areas I'm not familiar with. And honestly, the cameras aren't there yet for my needs. So besides, it looks like DJI is about to lose their ability to fly in the States. So I'm glad I didn't invest in that. Anybody else? All right. All right, thank you.
Keep your mic open. All right, a lot of new images I've never seen before, Mike.
Yeah.
It's great that you refresh us and can continue adding to it. So thank you.
Absolutely.
It was a pleasure having you here today. So that concludes our June 22 meeting for everybody. Look for future meeting updates, and we'll get these videos out on the YouTube and send out an email when they're available. And thank you everyone for participating.